1,500 miles separated two realities on the night of March 9th, 1945, and neither group understood what was about to connect them in the most devastating 6 hours of urban warfare in human history. In Tokyo's Shitamachi district, families were finishing evening meals while children worked on homework assignments by lamplight, and factory workers trudged home from workshops scattered throughout residential blocks, producing war materials in buildings that doubled as homes. Air raid sirens had become background noise after months of high-altitude raids that dropped a few bombs and disappeared. So when the sirens activated around 22:30 hours, most people ignored them because running to shelters for nothing had become exhausting and pointless. Across the Pacific, at 3 captured island airfields in the Marianas, 334 Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers sat on runways with ground crews making final preparations on an unprecedented payload configuration. Each aircraft carried 40 cluster bombs containing 38 incendiary bomblets filled with jellied gasoline that burned at 2,000 degrees, and the bombers had been stripped of most defensive guns to accommodate the extra weight, because Major General Curtis LeMay had made a calculated gamble that Japanese defenses were too weak to matter anymore. Everything about this mission violated every rule in the Strategic Bombing Manual, because altitude would be 5,000 to 7,000 feet. Instead of 30,000, the attack would happen at night when visibility was minimal. Aircraft would approach individually rather than in protective formations, and defensive armament had been removed to maximize bomb capacity. As sunset faded and the first B-29 lifted off with right engines roaring, history's most destructive conventional bombing raid began its journey toward a city whose own construction characteristics would amplify the weapon's effects beyond anything planners had anticipated. What happened next would kill more people in one night than either atomic bomb, would prove that Japan's air defenses had collapsed completely, and would demonstrate that American industrial capacity could produce destruction on a scale that made continuing the war obviously futile. Tokyo in early 1945 wasn't just vulnerable to fire, it was practically designed to burn as efficiently as possible given centuries of architectural tradition combined with wartime overcrowding. The city had evolved organically over hundreds of years, without central planning, where traditional construction emphasized wood framing with paper shoji screens, straw tatami flooring, and tile roofing, because stone and concrete existed mainly in government districts, while residential areas where most people lived consisted almost entirely of combustible materials. Population density in working-class neighborhoods exceeded 100,000 people per square mile, where the Asakusa, Honjo, and Fukagawa wards packed families into spaces measured in feet, with alleys between buildings often too narrow for 2 people to pass comfortably. Extended families lived in multi-generational households under single roofs, where privacy was minimal and personal space was a luxury almost nobody possessed. And this density resulted from cultural traditions emphasizing communal living combined with wartime factors that brought rural migrants to Tokyo seeking factory work. Housing construction had stopped completely as resources were diverted to military production. So families doubled up, rooms were subdivided, and every available space was occupied until residential blocks became tinderboxes waiting for ignition. Fire had plagued Tokyo. Throughout its history, where the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 killed over 100,000 people, primarily through fires that spread uncontrollably through wooden neighborhoods, and traditional firefighting relied on bucket brigades and hand pumps because water pressure in residential areas was insufficient for modern suppression. The city had fire departments and equipment, but these were designed for peacetime emergencies involving individual buildings, not wartime conflagrations that would consume entire districts simultaneously. American intelligence officers had studied Tokyo's vulnerabilities with obsessive detail, where the Office of Strategic Services compiled assessments of Japanese urban areas by examining pre-war insurance maps, architectural surveys, and industrial distribution data. They identified neighborhoods that combined high population density with significant war production, and the Shitamachi district emerged as the optimal target because this northeastern section housed approximately 750,000 residents across roughly 12 square miles. But more importantly, Japanese manufacturing had been deliberately dispersed throughout residential areas. Small workshops operated from homes and family businesses, where a single city block might contain facilities producing aircraft instruments, electrical components, precision tools, and military uniforms. So destroying residential areas would simultaneously eliminate industrial capacity. American planners recognized that Tokyo's wooden construction and dense layout created perfect conditions for incendiary weapons. Because fire would spread rapidly through connected structures, narrow alleys would block evacuation routes, limited water supply would prevent effective firefighting, and the city's own characteristics would multiply the weapon's destructive power exponentially. Curtis Emerson LeMay took command of the 21st Bomber Command on January 20, 1945, inheriting a strategic bombing campaign that was accomplishing almost nothing despite months of effort and resources. B-29s had been conducting high-altitude precision bombing against Japanese industrial targets for 3 months, with results that were consistently disappointing because the jet stream over Japan created winds approaching 250 miles per hour at bombing altitude, where bombardiers couldn't compensate accurately, and bombs scattered miles off target. Cloud cover obscured targets approximately 80% of the time. Radar bombing lacked precision, and after months of operations, damage assessment photographs showed minimal industrial destruction that didn't justify the resources being expended. Aircraft losses were acceptable, but mechanical failure rates were concerning because climbing to 30,000 feet with heavy bomb loads strained Wright R-3350 engines beyond design specifications, where cylinder head temperatures exceeded safe limits, magnesium components failed, and maintenance crews struggled to keep bombers operational. LeMay had commanded bomber groups in Europe before transferring to the Pacific, so he understood strategic bombing from both theoretical and practical perspectives. But he also understood that the current approach wasn't working, and something fundamental had to change immediately. His analysis was methodical and brutal, where high-altitude bombing was ineffective due to winds and weather. Precision attacks required visibility and accuracy that were rarely achievable, and Japanese industrial targets were dispersed and difficult to destroy individually. LeMay proposed stripping defensive guns from B-29s, except tail positions to reduce weight by approximately 6,000 pounds, and allow aircraft to carry twice the normal bomb load. And he proposed flying at 5,000 to 7,000 feet below the jet stream and above most light anti-aircraft fire while conducting night attacks to avoid Japanese fighters and using incendiary weapons against urban areas where industry and housing were integrated. The plan was radical and controversial because removing defensive guns seemed suicidal. Low-altitude attacks would expose bombers to ground fire. Night operations were inherently dangerous, and deliberately targeting urban areas raised obvious questions about civilian casualties that some staff officers found troubling. LeMay's response was characteristically blunt, where he argued that Japanese night fighters were ineffective without radar. Anti-aircraft guns lacked fire control systems for accurate night shooting, and darkness combined with speed would provide more protection than machine guns ever could. Regarding civilian casualties, he maintained that Japanese workers producing war materials in their homes were legitimate military targets under total war doctrine, and his calculation was cold but logical because one massive incendiary raid destroying a major industrial area would accomplish more than months of ineffective precision bombing. If successful, the tactic could be repeated against every major Japanese city, but if unsuccessful, his career would end, and crews would die in large numbers for nothing. General Henry Arnold, commanding the 20th Air Force from Washington, gave approval, and LeMay selected Tokyo as the first target because weather forecasts predicted clear skies and strong surface winds for March 9th and 10th, creating ideal conditions for what he intended to unleash. The weapons and aircraft that would strike Tokyo represented American industrial capability, operating at levels that would have seemed impossible just years earlier, and the technology involved was cutting-edge for 1945. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was the most advanced bomber in existence, where development began in 1940 with Army Air Corps specifications for a next-generation heavy bomber, and Boeing's design incorporated features that were revolutionary, including pressurized crew compartments for high-altitude operations, remote-controlled gun turrets that eliminated exposed gunner positions, and a central fire control system with computer assistance. 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines provided 2,200 horsepower each, with maximum takeoff weight reaching 140,000 pounds and combat radius exceeding 1,600 miles, so the aircraft could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs to distant targets and return to base. Manufacturing required coordination across multiple facilities, where Boeing plants in Seattle, Renton, and Wichita produced aircraft, while Glenn L. Martin Company in Omaha and Bell Aircraft at Marietta contributed additional production, and by March 1945, approximately 2,000 B-29s had been delivered with production rates exceeding 4 aircraft per day. The cost was staggering at approximately $3 billion for the entire program, equivalent to roughly $45 billion in modern currency, and exceeding the Manhattan Project's expenditure, where each individual aircraft cost $640,000. The incendiary weapons represented equally sophisticated engineering, where the M69 bomblet was designed specifically to destroy Japanese urban construction, and Chemical Warfare Service researchers collaborated with Standard Oil scientists to develop napalm by mixing naphthenic and palmitic acids with gasoline to create jellied fuel. Napalm had characteristics that made it ideal for urban warfare because it adhered to surfaces rather than flowing away. Water couldn't extinguish it effectively, and it burned at 1,800 to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, with sufficient heat to ignite wood, paper, and fabric instantly while melting glass and metal over time. The M69 was a hexagonal tube 3 inches in diameter and 20 inches long, weighing 6.2 pounds, with an ignition system incorporating a time delay fuse, and upon impact, the fuse burned for 3 to 5 seconds before detonation. This delay allowed the weapon to penetrate roofing and reach building interiors before a white phosphorus charge ruptured the casing and dispersed napalm across approximately 100 feet in multiple directions, creating an ignition pattern that was almost impossible to extinguish. Each M69 was packaged with 37 others in an E-46 cluster bomb that descended like a conventional bomb until reaching approximately 2,000 feet, where metal straps released and the cluster opened, allowing 38 individual bomblets to separate and fall independently. A cotton streamer attached to each bomblet deployed during descent to orient the weapon fuse downward for proper detonation, and testing at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah's desert involved constructing authentic replicas of Japanese residential structures using architectural plans obtained before the war. Test structures included typical Tokyo homes with wood frames, tatami floors, paper shoji screens, and tile roofs, and repeated testing refined the M69's design until it achieved maximum effectiveness against Japanese construction. For the Tokyo raid, each B-29 carried 40 E-46 clusters containing 1,520 individual M69 bomblets, and with 279 aircraft ultimately reaching the target, approximately 424,000 incendiary devices would fall on a single district in one night. If you want to see what happened when this unprecedented concentration of incendiary weapons hit the most densely populated urban area on Earth, and how one night killed more people than either atomic bomb, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because every like and subscription helps us share these meticulously researched historical accounts with more people. And it tells YouTube to show this content to viewers who understand that history's most important lessons often come from its darkest moments. Let's continue. The first Pathfinder B-29s crossed Tokyo's coastline at 0008 hours on March 10th, flying at 5,000 feet through clear night air, where lead bombardiers released M47 napalm bombs that ignited on impact and created an enormous burning X pattern across the target zone. The fires were visible for miles and provided an aiming point for the main bomber force approaching minutes behind, and air raid sirens had activated at 22:30 hours, but most Tokyo residents paid minimal attention because previous raids had caused limited damage. Many people stayed in their homes rather than seeking shelter, and those who did evacuate moved without urgency because civil defense drills emphasized orderly behavior where panic was considered shameful and undignified. The main bomber stream arrived beginning at 0015 hours, with aircraft approaching from different directions at staggered intervals, and this routing prevented bunching while allowing continuous bombing over an extended period. Bombardiers aimed for the burning markers, and at release altitude between 5,000 and 7,000 feet, accuracy was significantly better than from 30,000 feet, where the jet stream scattered bombs, so the E-46 cluster bombs tumbled downward and opened at 2,000 feet altitude. Thousands of individual M69 bomblets separated and descended across the target area, and residents on the ground described seeing metallic rain falling through darkness where the sound was compared to hail striking rooftops. But within minutes, thousands of individual ignition points erupted simultaneously because the M69's time delay fuses ensured bomblets detonated after penetrating into buildings. Napalm sprayed through rooms and spaces where everything combustible ignited instantly, including wood framing, paper screens, tatami mats, clothing, and furniture, so the structures themselves became fuel feeding. The growing inferno. Weather conditions amplified the weapon's effects dramatically because surface winds measured between 20 and 30 miles per hour, with gusts reaching 45 miles per hour. And these winds spread flames from building to building faster than people could react, where fire crossed alleys and streets carried by wind-borne embers and radiant heat. The phenomenon of conflagration began within 30 minutes as separate fires merged into larger blazes, and as fires grew, they generated powerful convection currents where hot air rose rapidly and created partial vacuums at ground level. Surrounding air rushed inward to replace rising air, and these fire-induced winds reached velocities exceeding 60 miles per hour at ground level, creating a self-sustaining firestorm that fed itself because wind spread flames. Flames generated more wind, and temperatures escalated beyond napalm's initial burning temperature. Radiant heat alone became sufficient to ignite. Materials without direct flame contact, where wooden buildings exploded into fire and asphalt streets melted and ignited, transforming entire city blocks into furnaces within minutes. B-29 crews experienced the firestorm's power at altitude, where aircraft encountered severe turbulence from thermal updrafts, and pilots reported losing or gaining hundreds of feet uncontrollably, while some aircraft were flipped inverted by convection currents. The violence of the turbulence injured crew members despite safety harnesses, and the smell reached aircraft at 7,000 feet, where smoke penetrated pressurization systems and crews described the stench as burning wood mixed with chemicals and organic matter that made several crew members vomit. Visual effects were apocalyptic because the fire created its own illumination visible for over 150 miles, where crews described it as sunrise in the middle of night, and the glow reflected off clouds at high altitude while smoke columns rose to 20,000 feet or higher. The bombing continued for approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes, with aircraft attacking in continuous stream at intervals of 2 to 3 minutes between bombers, and by the time the last B-29 departed, the entire target area was unified conflagration where separate fires had ceased to exist, and one massive fire consumed everything across 15.8 square miles. 37-year-old Hiroshi Tanaka lived with his wife and 3 children in Honjo Ward, and when the attack began, he heard air raid sirens but stayed inside because running to shelters had become pointless after so many false alarms. Then sounds like gravel hitting the roof started, and his oldest son went outside to investigate before running back inside shouting that fire was everywhere, so Tanaka's family fled their home carrying only what they wore. The alley outside was already crowded with neighbors evacuating, but the wind was unlike anything Tanaka had experienced even during typhoons, because it was hot and carried burning pieces of everything where paper, wood, and building fragments, all on fire, were flying through the air like lethal projectiles. The family attempted reaching a designated evacuation area 3 blocks away, but never arrived because the fire moved faster than they could run, where buildings were exploding into flames on both sides while people screamed and children cried as everyone tried reaching the river. Tanaka became separated from his wife and children in the chaos because the crowd was like a stampede, where people were being knocked down and trampled, and he was trying to hold his daughter's hand when someone pushed between them. So he lost her and lost all of them in the crowd that was moving with terrifying momentum. He survived by diving into a canal filled with others seeking refuge from the heat where the water was cold, but the air was so hot that breathing became difficult, and people were packed in the canal like sardines. Some drowned because there wasn't room to stay above water, while others died from the heat, even while submerged, creating a nightmare scenario where water offered no real protection from the inferno, consuming everything around them. 17-year-old Keiko Nakamura was working night shift at a factory producing parachute fabric when the raid began, and she remembered that factory windows shattered from heat before fire even reached the building. Workers ran outside and saw the sky was orange because everything was burning, and the supervisor ordered them to run to the Sumida River because he said water was the only safety available, so Keiko ran with approximately 30 workers and students, but they couldn't stay on main roads because they were rivers of fire where asphalt was melting and burning. They went through alleys and jumped over fences while behind them the fire was like a wall chasing them with relentless speed. And at the Sumida River, she witnessed scenes that would haunt her for life, because thousands of people were trying to get into the water. The bridges were packed, and some bridges collapsed under the weight, while bodies floated everywhere. And the heat was so intense that even being in water wasn't enough, because people near the banks were being cooked by radiant heat despite being submerged. Keiko survived by submerging completely, except for her face where she stayed in the water until dawn, and her lips were burned from hot air. Her hair was singed, but she lived while most of her friends from the factory died. 63-year-old Buddhist priest Takeshi Sato remained at his temple in Fukagawa Ward when families sought shelter there because perhaps 200 people came to the temple grounds believing concrete walls and tile roofs would provide protection. Sato knew it wouldn't be enough when he saw how large the fires were growing, and he tried convincing people to evacuate toward open areas. But most refused because they said the temple was sacred and would be protected by Buddha. He couldn't abandon them, so he stayed and chanted sutras while fire approached, and the temple survived. But those inside did not, because fire consumed wooden structures surrounding the main hall, where heat inside became unbearable, and people tried leaving, but the outside was complete flames. They died from heat and smoke, while Sato survived only because he lay flat on the stone floor in the corner where heat was slightly less intense. And when dawn came, he found himself surrounded by corpses. The bodies were burned beyond recognition, where he couldn't identify anyone, so he performed last rites for them all, though he didn't know their names, honoring the dead with whatever dignity remained possible. 12-year-old Akira Yoshida became separated from his mother when their neighborhood ignited, and his mother told him to run to the school because she said she would meet him there. But the school was burning when he arrived, so everyone who went there died. He didn't know where to go, so he just ran away from the fire, and Akira survived by finding a concrete water reservoir constructed for firefighting, where he climbed inside with maybe 10 other people who stayed underwater as much as possible because the air was so hot it hurt to breathe. They could hear people outside screaming, but couldn't help them, and he never saw his mother, father, or 2 sisters again, because after the fire he searched for days and looked at bodies, but couldn't recognize anyone. So eventually he stopped looking because he knew they were gone. These testimonies represent fragments of experience from a night when over 100,000 people died, and most victims left no testimony because they simply disappeared into flames and ash without leaving any trace of their final moments. Morning light on March 10th revealed landscapes that resembled the end of the world, where dense residential neighborhoods had been replaced by ash and twisted metal covering everything. Concrete foundations marked where buildings once stood, while everything combustible had been completely consumed, and the ground was covered with white ash several inches deep that shifted like snow in the wind and contained the remains of buildings, possessions, and people all mixed together. Bodies were everywhere because some were carbonized remnants reduced to skeletal fragments, while others appeared almost intact, but were dead from heat and smoke inhalation, and many were impossible to count as individuals because only scattered remains existed mixed with debris. The Tokyo Fire Department estimated over 97,000 people died during the raid, while Tokyo Metropolitan Police reported 83,793 deaths, and the United States Strategic Bombing Survey calculated 87,793 killed with 40,918 injured. Historical consensus places the death toll above 100,000, making this single raid more lethal than either atomic bombing, and some historians suggest the true figure may have exceeded 120,000 when victims who died from injuries in subsequent days are included. Physical destruction was measured precisely because the fire consumed 267,171 buildings across 15.8 square miles, representing approximately 1/4 of Tokyo's total structures, where the burned area was roughly equivalent to Lower Manhattan from the Battery to Central Park. Over 1 million residents lost their homes, and population in affected wards declined by approximately 65% as survivors fled to rural areas or other cities. So Tokyo's population, which had been 7.3 million in 1940, would fall to 2.8 million by August 1945. Industrial damage was severe and measurable because American intelligence estimated that more than half of Tokyo's war production occurred in small workshops within residential areas where these cottage industries produced aircraft instruments, electrical components, precision mechanisms, optical equipment, and various military supplies. Their destruction created immediate shortages throughout Japan's military logistics system, and thousands of skilled workers were killed or displaced permanently, where many survivors refused to return to Tokyo even after the war ended. So the exodus of experienced craftsmen and technicians damaged industrial capacity beyond the physical destruction of facilities. Infrastructure destruction extended beyond buildings because water mains melted and burst. Electrical systems were completely destroyed across affected areas. Telephone networks were annihilated, and transportation infrastructure, including streetcar lines and train stations, were demolished. Reconstruction would have required resources Japan did not possess, and time the war would not allow. So much of the damage remained unrepaired for years. Medical response was overwhelmed instantly because hospitals in undamaged areas received thousands of burn victims and injured survivors. But medical supplies were already scarce due to American submarine blockade. Doctors and nurses worked without adequate bandages, antiseptics, anesthetics, or pain medication, and many injured survivors died from infections or complications in the days following the raid because treatment capabilities couldn't match the scale of casualties. Body disposal became a massive challenge because remains were collected by work crews over several weeks, where mass cremations occurred at designated sites with Buddhist ceremonies performed when possible. Most victims were cremated in mass funeral pyres without individual services, and ashes were interred in mass graves that would become memorials after the war because individual identification was impossible for the vast majority of victims. The psychological impact transcended physical damage because survivors exhibited what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, where many became unable to function normally. Children stopped speaking, and adults showed signs of severe depression and anxiety, while the cultural emphasis on endurance and stoic acceptance was tested beyond limits, creating a generation of traumatized survivors who would carry the memories of that night for the rest of their lives. American losses were lighter than expected given the scale of the operation, with 14 B-29s lost and 96 airmen killed or missing, while others returned damaged. Losses came from turbulence, anti-aircraft fire, night fighters, and mechanical failures. But the overall rate was about 4%, validating LeMay's tactics. Within days, similar incendiary raids struck Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe, leaving Japan's 4 largest cities devastated in just 8 days before operations paused due to depleted bomb stocks. By late March, attacks resumed, and by August 1945, 66 Japanese cities had been burned, devastating urban Japan before the atomic bombings. Refugees spread first-hand accounts that undermined propaganda, increased factory absenteeism, and normalized routine air raids. Japanese leaders knew air defense was futile, but chose continued production over civilian safety. The firebombing campaign helped push Japan toward surrender by demonstrating that no city was safe, and resistance meant annihilation. The Tokyo raid alone killed over 100,000 people, destroyed hundreds of thousands of buildings, and left lasting trauma. Debate continues over its necessity and morality, but its impact reshaped warfare and military doctrine permanently. Let us know where you're watching from because we'd love to hear from you, and if you enjoy meticulously researched historical content like this, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. See you in the next one.